Here is a big question about Japan, the third biggest economy and the closest ally of the United States during the absence of American leadership in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, do the uncertainty of Donald Trump's presidency as well as the geopolitical rivalry in Northeast Asia mean that the Shinzo Abe administration would reconsider its China policy? What are the implications of the U.S.-Japan Security Pact for the Taiwan Strait since Tsai Ing-wen refused to adopt the One China principle and the 1992 consensus? Why has Prime Minister Shinzo Abe decided to send its aircraft carrier to the South China Sea to showcase its military muscles? We have many questions about the role that Japan could play in Northeast Asia. To address these issues and more, we are pleased to be joined here by Mr. Michael Swin, a senior research fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Let's first of all look at the brainchild of President Xi Jinping about the Belt and Road Initiative, which means that we're going to invest heavily in the infrastructure of developing countries. Japan has been pretty reluctant. However, at the recently concluded summit dialogue in Beijing, head of the LDP, the ruling party of Japan, handed over a letter which was written by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to show a goodwill for being part of not only the Belt and Road, but also to seriously improve the bilateral relationship. I'd like to have your take about the latest.
Well, I think the response of the Japanese government is indeed part of an effort by the Abe government to try to improve the relationship with China. And it, I think, reflects the idea that Japan could be a positive contribution in the One Belt, One Road through its expertise in a variety of areas, both in infrastructure, in financing possibly, in trade areas. So I think it's not a surprising development, to tell you the truth, that Abe would make this type of overture.
Initially, the Japanese authorities thought that ADB is on a collision course with the AIIB. They argued that since ADB has done a lot of work for the investment in infrastructure, why should China put forward its own brainchild of AIIB? Will AIIB be used by the Beijing authorities, according to Tokyo, to be used as a counterweight against the Japanese influence? It seems those guys in Tokyo tend to examine the picture in black and white terms, and they are still in the shadow of the Cold War.
Well, I don't really agree with that. I think that the Japanese position on this has evolved over time. I think there was some initial concern about the AIIB, in part because of the United States position. There was great uncertainty about what exactly the U.S. position would be on AIIB. It seemed to resist the idea of other countries, allies, joining the AIIB. I think that was a mistake in the administration, in the U.S. government, frankly. And I don't think it was part of a concerted strategy, per se, by the U.S. government to exclude actively participation by others for strategic reasons. I think there was a general sense about not being certain about what the rules would be in AIIB for governing lending to developing countries, and whether or not these would be along the lines of what the World Bank or International Monetary Fund was doing in terms of its lending. But over time, I think there's been reassurances because of the structure of the AIIB, the membership of the governing board of the AIIB, and the guidelines for lending that indicate very clearly that it's not a competition. It's not going to replace the Asia Development Bank or the World Bank or the IMF. It's going to be a major supplement, which is going to provide, I think, very important financing for, in particular, infrastructure projects in Asia, which are highly needed. And so China's role in this, I think, is it's not dominating it per se. It's played a facilitating role. And I think the Japanese have come along in that regard, as has the United States. So I don't see the AIIB as being that big of an issue anymore.
Given the presidential unpredictability of Donald Trump and the absence of American leadership, if not absence of a strategy in Asia, it seems Japan is mired in strategic anxiety and does not know clearly how to position itself in Northeast Asia geopolitically. With your geopolitical expertise, what what will be the next steps that the Abe administration is likely to take to clarify the current confusion and ambiguity about the China-Japan relationship?
Well, I think there's been a certain amount of clarification that has occurred. Keep in mind, when the Trump administration first took office, it was extremely unclear what its position was towards Asian allies because of remarks that Trump had made during the campaign, which had been potentially very disadvantageous to the Japanese and to others. But since that time, you've had numerous trips now by Mattis, by the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Mattis, by also Secretary Tillerson to Japan. You've had President Abe, you've had Prime Minister Abe then meeting with Trump. And there's been, I think, a fair amount of assurance that Japan's role in the alliance will remain close and will remain strong. And right now, I think a lot of the emphasis is on coordinating with Japan in dealing with questions like North Korea, where the Japanese have a very clear stake, an important stake. And I don't see a huge real difference between the U.S. and Japanese position on this right now. So I don't see the level of concern and anxiety in Japan at this point. Sure, there's some uncertainty because Trump is a somewhat unpredictable leader, but I think there's a reasonable degree of confidence in Japan that Trump is not going to do anything that's going to really damage the relationship. So the question really is keeping it on an even keel going forward.
We've heard different voices from the United States, with one voice arguing strongly that any attempt by the two governments to get close will be a nightmare for the forward military presence of the United States. Up to 70,000 of them are still in Northeast Asia, to strengthen the American military presence there and to balance the geopolitical factors there. The other voice argues that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe should not visit Yasukuni on a regular basis to provoke China. Mm-hmm. Which voice takes the upper hand and prevails?
Well, I don't believe that there is a really strong voice in the United States that says closer Sino-Japanese relations are going to be at the expense of the United States. I think most Americans tend to believe that Japan, by virtue of both its geopolitical position, its political system, etc., is by disposition much more oriented towards the United States. And they don't think that's going to change significantly in any future period. Now, Japan has always been concerned that the United States and China will make understandings or agreements that would be at their disadvantage. They've also been concerned at times that U.S. relations with China would pull Japan into a confrontation that they don't want. So Japan really wants to keep a position with the United States that is close and confident, but at the same time wants to maintain good relations with China. And I don't think that necessarily is going to be to the detriment of either major power.
About 6 years ago, the issue of Diaoyu Islands flared up all of a sudden, and both governments were caught unprepared with the alleged purchase of Diaoyu Islands by the Japanese government. That China was angry. And so bilateral relationship started to deteriorate sharply.
Right.
And many skeptical voices in China say the United States seems to be the only winner, lurking behind the veil of the bilateral animosity. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I don't think that the United States pushed or manipulated Japan into a confrontation with China in order to avoid closer Sino-Japanese relations. I think that the United States wanted that dispute over those islands, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, to be peacefully managed and resolved. And I think there was concern both for Japan's of that issue, that it did not accurately assess the Chinese response, and also concern about China's reaction, which I think the United States believed was a case of overreaction and led to a new situation that makes the situation more tense.
In fact, when we address the issue of geopolitical or strategic uncertainty in Northeast Asia, there's yet another major player, the Republic of Korea, which is also a close ally of the United States. And over the issue of comfort women, these two most important neighboring countries of China are in fact on loggerheads, to the dismay and disappointment of the United States. What do you think of the very embarrassing relationship between Seoul and Tokyo? In fact, these two countries were for a while able to exchange intelligence reports on the dangers of the Korean Peninsula.
Well, I think it's a challenge. I think it's very true that China and Japan and South Korea have tensions over issues of comfort women, tensions over territorial. They have their own territorial disputes.
Right.
And we're not going to remove those anytime soon. You're not going to have Korea and Japan and the United States in absolute lockstep on every aspect of security in Northeast Asia. Korea's position, to a great extent, these security relationships are bilateral relationships between the U.S. and South Korea and the U.S. and Japan.
With the enormous popularity of Moon Jae-in, the newly elected leader of ROK, do you think it's an opportunity for the United States to bring Japan and South Korea, your two allies, together and get them closer in addressing the issue of denuclearization? And China also agreed in the spirit of a Mar-a-Lago summit in Florida to help the United States and defuse the crisis there.
I don't think that that's likely to be the case. I think that we have yet to see really what the new administration in South Korea is going to do in terms of policies towards North Korea. There is a desire on the part of President Moon to become he wants to continue to try to put pressure on North Korea. He's said that. I don't think he's going to make a bold shift towards a overture to North Korea anytime soon.
You don't think there's going to be yet another version of the Sunshine Policy, a policy that he may have inherited from his master, Kim Dae-jung? Kim Dae-jung won Nobel Prize for the Sunshine Policy.
Right. I think he's going to have to be cautious about this because the threat from North Korea today is significantly greater than it was during the Sunshine Policy. And his need to be able to show that he can defend South Korea against possible threats from North Korea is much greater. So I think it's important. I think it's a good idea to try to think of ways in which he could have overtures to North Korea, but this has to occur in the context of the kinds of understandings that the South Korean government has reached with the United States and Japan on this issue. Because Japan and the U.S. on this issue, I think, are pretty close in how they think that the North Korea problem should be dealt with. And I think South Korea there is not going to be in total lockstep with Japan and with the United States, but it's not going to be a simple return to the Sunshine Policy. I think that's not that likely.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Michael Swin, a senior research fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are discussing security scenario and security architecture in Northeast Asia during the presidency of Donald Trump. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
Let's look at the implications of the U.S.-Japan Security Pact. Now, it should be viewed in the context of Article 9 of the Pacifist Constitution. The Abe administration has been pushing very hard for an amendment to a rewriting of Article 9, which has caused strong repercussions from the neighboring countries of ROK and China. We are both victims of the Japanese invasion during the Second World War. I'd like to have your comments on the impact of such an effort by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
Well, I, in general, am not a big supporter of the revision of the Japanese Constitution in the way in which Prime Minister Abe, I think, wants to revise it. I am a supporter of the reinterpretation of the provision in the Japanese Constitution that allows for the Japanese to use their self-defense forces in defense of their vital security interests and the home islands. I think that reinterpretation has made it easier for Japan to be able to provide assistance to the United States and to act on its own in some regards, but again, to protect the Japanese home islands and protect the direct security and sovereignty of Japan. I think a reinterpretation of the Constitution that would in effect make Japan into a quote-unquote normal military power along the same lines as Great Britain, let's say, in its relationship with the United States, I don't think that that kind of a change, particularly in the near to medium term, would benefit stability in the Far East. I think Japan should, and I think Japan's public opinion believes that Japan's role should remain relatively limited in how it operates as a security actor in the Western Pacific.
Given the clear majority in the Japanese Diet, it seems the current reinterpretation of the provision in the pacifist constitution will allow the Japanese self-defense forces to be deployed throughout the whole world. And that's going to make a sea difference.
I'm not sure that that's the case, though.
You don't think so?
I think there's going to be a lot
but what about
of
the
dispute.
What about the South China Sea? The aircraft carrier Isuzu was sent there,
I know,
taking aboard diplomats from the 10 member states of ASEAN,
right,
to showcase the muscles of the Japanese self-defense forces, and that's very provocative for the Chinese.
Well, it's one thing to steam a Japanese ship through the South China Sea and have people visit it. It's another thing for Japan to be conducting what would be combat patrols and active, let's say, freedom navigation patrols, ones where the Japanese Navy is regularly and actively involved in security issues in the South China Sea, because even under the reinterpretation of the Japanese Constitution, what the Japanese self-defense forces can do has to be related very clearly in the minds of the Japanese public to the defense of Japan. And so you have to make an argument that conducting those kinds of activities in the South China Sea is clearly, unambiguously related to the defense of Japan. I think it's a hard argument to make.
Well, you surprised me, Michael, about this argument, since the Japanese media and the LDP have both been arguing whether Japanese self forces should be deployed proactively after the reinterpretation. Now, here is one prospect about the Diaoyu Islands, and actually it's been it occurred before. Whenever tensions are rising in the South China Sea, you're going to see a reciprocal rise in the tensions between Japan and China surrounding Diaoyu Islands. Observations from the mainland of China argue this is a deliberate attempt by the Chinese authorities to reassure a neighboring country of Japan, look, if you are going to provoke China in the South China Sea, we're going to create a kind of situation where you have to be very serious about the Diaoyu Islands. Now, things are okay, are fine. Quiet water runs deep there, disputed waters of the Diaoyu Islands. But if such a joint patrol were to occur in the South China Sea, the Chinese authorities will not be sitting back idly without doing anything. What do you think of such a self-fulfilling prophecy on the Chinese side?
Yes, I mean, making those connections between Japanese behavior in the South China Sea with Chinese behavior in the East China Sea, I think is a dangerous proposition. I think it leads people to assume that China will use its position in one or the other of these areas to increase tensions in ways that I think would not be beneficial. A lot would depend on how what the Japanese government were to be doing, let's say in the South China Sea, and then how the Chinese government would look at this problem. As I said before, if the Chinese government just looks at the Japanese sailing through the South China Sea with a warship and it thinks it needs to deter Japan, upping the tension in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, I think that overreaction will not benefit China.
It's not Senkaku, it's Diaoyu Islands in Chinese perspective. Now, a subcontext for raising this question and raising this concern about the relationship between Diaoyu Islands and the South China Sea is two critical players, if not game changers, in the South China Sea. Vietnam, and particularly Manila, have agreed to find a peaceful solution to the disputed territorial waters in the South China Sea, with President Duterte coming to Beijing hand in hand, asking for more of the Chinese investment in their revitalization of the economy. And the Vietnamese government sent their high-profile delegation to Beijing, one after another, to talk about bilateral economic cooperation and trade. In this new circumstance, an aircraft carrier from the Japanese self-defense was sent to the South China Sea, and from the Chinese perspective, it's very provocative, it's unnecessary, it's meant to create troubles. And therefore, China would not do would not sit back without doing anything about the Diaoyu Islands, right? Don't you think this makes sense? It's reasonable.
Well, has China done something towards the Diaoyu Islands as a result of this Japanese ship moving
not
through the
yet.
South China Sea?
This is
you
just
think it's
a prophecy. This is just one calculation, one calculus.
Right. Well, I think you have a dynamic here which is the case. You do have China that looks at the activities of other countries other than the United States, acting in the South China Sea as in some way part of a larger strategic design, and it's connected with the United States. That's not always the case. What the Japanese government does, again, in the South China Sea, I think, is limited. I don't see it as playing the kind of role in the South China Sea that you see, for example, the United States government playing or any of the claimants playing. Keep in mind, Japan is not a claimant in the South China Sea.
It's not.
It has no stake in the sovereignty
However,
issues
taking the previous Shangri-La security dialogue as an example, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe delivered a keynote presentation at the reception dinner. I was there, and I heard him talking smart about rule of law, referring in his understatement, of course, to UNCLOS and the international arbitration about the island reclamation or rebuilding. So, having said this, let's look at Taiwan. I mean, we can talk for hours about the South China Sea because the 9-dash line, the history, so on and so forth.
Well, I would just one point, though. Yes. I would just say that I think that Chinese should not overemphasize what role Japan might play in the South China Sea. I don't think it is going to be the case where Japan is going to become a partner with the United States operating in freedom of navigation operations or steaming warships through the South China Sea and taking the sort of position that the United States has taken in dealing with some of these disputes. I think Japan, again, its role there is going to remain limited.
Thank you for clarifying somehow the American position on the South China Sea and the presence of Japanese Navy there. The last issue is very much about Taiwan. We all know that since the Chinese Navy was defeated towards the end of the 19th century, Taiwan was put under colonial occupation and rule of Japan. Now, people may have been misled by the impression that the Taiwan Relations Act would serve as a bulwark against the alleged threats from the mainland China. In fact, Japan is lurking behind. And in fact, one scholar who is very influential in Taiwan warned me a few years back, look, Ray, another player which is equally important about the future of Taiwan is Japan. It cares about the democracy there, the values, and also the cross-strait relationship. Of course, I have some fishing disputes with Japan. But what do you think of the role Japan plays in shaping the future of the cross-strait relationship?
I think Japan's role in influencing the cross-strait relationship has mainly to do with seeing that the Taiwan issue does not create conflict between the United States and China, which would never serve Japan's interests. It also is concerned that any kind of future possible reconciliation that occurs between Taiwan and mainland China is one that doesn't occur at the expense of Japan in some way. I think that those concerns are reasonable ones, but I don't think they lead to Japan playing a major role in influencing how mainland China and Taiwan interact with each other. Yes, there's a historical relationship there. Yes, there's suspicion in China about Japan's role in all of this. But I don't see Japan as being in any way a power or in any way a blocker of possible reconciliation. I would say the United States, if China, mainland China and Taiwan can peacefully achieve some kind of understanding that leads in the future to some form of unification, Japan shouldn't stand in the way, and the United States shouldn't try to have Japan stand in the way. I think that kind of reconciliation, unless you have a U.S.-China conflict that would really make the Taiwan issue much more important strategically for the United States, I don't see that the United States has an interest in supporting any kind of right-wing Japanese view, for example, to keep Taiwan separate from the mainland.
Very quickly, the last issue is about the current sharp decline in the Taiwan Strait between Tsai Ing-wen and the mainland authorities. Since Tsai Ing-wen refused to adopt the 1992 consensus about one China, and political foundation has been seriously eroded between the two sides.
Yes.
Do you think this will lead to more uncertainty and put the United States and China in uncharted waters?
I think much depends on not the current Tsai Ing-wen government and the DPP government today. It depends on the viability of the Kuomintang. It depends on what the Kuomintang's position is going to be as a viable political entity in Taiwanese politics. If the Kuomintang, which is in considerable disarray today, continues in that fashion, and the DPP is able to take advantage of that in some way, then you can have a sustained period of rule in Taiwan that I think China would become increasingly concerned about. So I think it's really incumbent upon China, in part, to be able to have policies that can strengthen and improve the position of the Kuomintang government, of the Kuomintang party, pardon me, in Taiwan, such that there is a viable alternative to a pro-independence party.
In fact, the mainland is indeed at the mercy of the political uncertainty in Taiwan. Thank you much for being this part of dialogue at CGTN. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome.